I'm Topher Browne, and I'm here at Trident Fly Fishing in Maine, and we're going to tie a tube fly today. And tube flies are tied on a cylinder, usually plastic or metal, and then the hook is added after you tie the fly. And they've got a number of advantages which allow you to change your hook out if you ding the hook on a back cast, and they allow you to use double hooks where they're legal for salmon fishing. And so we're going to tie a marabou fly today, which can be used equally well for steelhead fishing. And it's actually really a steelhead fly and sort of migrated into Atlantic salmon fishing. And it uses all the colors under the rainbow of marabou. And I don't think the fish are really too concerned about what colors you use, as long as the basic profile of the fly is appropriate. In other words, you don't want too much or too little on there. And then if you're fishing in very clear water, you might want to use something that's not quite as loud as, say, this cerise color. You might want to mute your colors down. So try and balance the fly to the type of river or the clarity of the water that you're fishing. And so let's get started tying a tube fly. Okay, let's tie a tube fly. A tube fly is tied on generally a plastic tube. There's a lot of different models out there on the market today. This is one from HMH. Plastic tube cut to length, meaning you can tie the fly and then cut it to length afterwards. This is a pro tube, and it has two thicknesses, which allows for weights to be put on at the front or a cone head to go on at the front. And we're going to demonstrate, actually we'll tie with this particular tube, and I'll put a cone head on at the end. The traditional style of tube flies are typically aluminum and brass, tungsten and copper, and that is the original tube fly. And one of the advantages of those types of tube flies is they have sink rates. So aluminum is generally your slowest sink rate, copper and brass are about in the middle, and then your fastest sinking tube is tungsten. One of the advantages of incorporating the weight into the actual material, or the tube itself, is you have a very accurate idea as to what the depth of your particular fly is. One of the disadvantages from a fly tying perspective of tubes that are made out of metal as opposed to plastic is they're more difficult to tie on. And one of the advantages of the plastic tubes is you can cut them after you have tied the fly. And you can add on pieces right at the very end of the fly and still cut the tube to length after you've added on your cone head, which makes the process of getting into tube flies and tying tube flies that much easier. Some people prefer the standard old-fashioned British style tube flies. I tend to fish them both, and because they both have their pluses and their minuses. So we're going to tie a marabou fly called a black and blue, and this is really a steelhead fly, but it works equally well for Atlantic salmon. And one of the beautiful things about this particular fly is that it's straightforward to tie, the materials are inexpensive, and it's not an overly difficult fly to tie. So I'm just going to put some thread on here. And this is what's called a marabou blood. And blood is one feather from the back of a turkey. It's a byproduct of the food industry. And so you shouldn't have any qualms about using it. Tied in by the tip, and then we're going to fold this. So I like the shiny side forward, you'll see that that side is, it's hard to see, but it's a little duller. There's also a curve to this, so the feather is curved like this. So I always prefer, and I think the proper way to do it is to have that curve facing towards the head of the fly. And then we're just going to wrap this in. So I like to fold it. You can pre-fold it. Take your scissors, run it the length of the stem itself, and it will actually make the folding quite a bit easier. So we're going to fold this and wrap it forward. Some people like to wet this, not necessary, and wetting it can actually make it more difficult to tie with. So I've got a twisting marabou blood, but I'm just kind of coaxing it into shape here. And there's a sweet spot on these feathers, which is generally right in the middle of the feather. So there's one in. Turn it, cut it. Okay, so we've wrapped blue marabou bloods around the tube fly, and I generally like 2 to 3. That gives a body thickness that I'm looking for. If you wrap too many marabou bloods around a tube fly or a hook shank, then you tend to get kind of a feather duster. And if you have not enough, then your profile is so slim that it's not particularly visible. So it depends on the quality of the marabou that you have. It depends on your own personal taste for what your profile, what sort of profile you're looking for. And if you wet this, and you'll get an idea of what it's going to slim down to in the water, and that's pretty darn good. So we've got another color to add on here and a little bit of flash, but that's generally what I'm looking for when I'm tying, is something about the thickness of a bait fish. This isn't rocket science, and there's no hard or fast rule to it. It's what looks good to the fisherman. And what looks good to the fisherman is based on the experience of that person on the water. So 3 bloods, 2 to 3 bloods. If you've got very good quality marabou, 2 bloods, not so good marabou, 3 bloods, and just wrap them on. And then I like to put my flash on underneath the very last blood that I'm going to wrap. So, and I do flash in 2 different layers. So the first layer is the lateral line. And so the lateral line of a bait fish, or any fish, is simply that line that you see that runs down the middle of the body of a bait fish or a large fish. And it is intricately linked to their ability to sense movement and vibration in the water. And so I'm just looking for a little bit of a splash of color on the side to imitate that lateral line, to give it the visual appearance of a bait fish. So I'm taking a piece of Flashabou, and I'm going to put one on either side, but I'm going to double it over. So take the Flashabou, fold it over your bobbin, and then just run it right down the thread until it's where you want to tie it. And there it is. I'll cut that right there. That one looking a little bit long, but not too bad. And we'll add a little bit of angel hair. So this is blue angel hair. And generally with flash, less is more. If you put too much flash in there, a fish is going to see it from a very long way away. And so there's a couple of different ways of looking at that. Some people think, well, I want the fish to see it. I'm going to layer in lots of flash here. The second way of looking at it is I want just enough flash in there to make it look bait fishy and realistic. But bait fish in general don't make a living by being easy to see. So if I'm going to imitate a bait fish with my flash or my fly, then I want it to be bait fishy, but I kind of want it to sneak up into the territory of a fish and then be quite visible. In other words, I don't want them necessarily to see my fly at 25 feet, maybe detect a little bit of movement. I want it to get up into the territory of a fish, the taking territory of a fish, and surprise the fish so that they have to make a quick decision as to whether or not they're going to eat the fly. And so if you put too much flash in there, they may see it at 25 feet. If you put not enough flash in there, they may not see it at all if the water is dirty. And so a lot of it depends on the clarity of the water. It also depends on the fish that you're pursuing. It depends on what you like in your flies. Sometimes, if the water is high on a particular river, you may want to put a lot of flash in there because generally high water means dirty water, or it certainly can. And so you're more interested at that point in time in making your flies easy to see. If you're fishing low water with the same pattern, you may want a slimmer profile with less flash in it so that it's not quite as obvious once the fly is in the water. And if you fished a high water fly with a lot of flash in there, in a low water situation where the river was very, very low, the fish are definitely going to see it at 25 feet away. And it's not going to surprise them by the time it enters their immediate territory where they're likely to grab it. So all of those things go into the decision-making process at the vise as to what you're going to tie. And one of the, so we're just going to fold this in just as we did the other 3 pieces of marabou. And we're just looking for a little contrast color over the top of the flash. And this fly, at least in the circles that I fish, is referred to as a black and blue, which is perhaps the least creative naming of a fly on record. But this thing is positively deadly. And it's deadly on steelhead, it's deadly on Atlantic salmon, it's deadly on brown trout. It's a great streamer for brown trout. And that's looking to be about where I'm looking for the thickness of this particular fly. So I'm going to tie that off. Cut it. A couple of wraps to seal it. And then I've got my fly tying comb, which everybody has, I am sure. And I'm just going to run it through there and get all those materials blending nicely into each other. So you can see this fly starting to take shape. I'll give it a little bit of moisture and you get an idea of what it's going to look like in the water. It looks dark and bait fishy with a little bit of flash in there. So a couple of different ways you can fish this exactly like it is. And very easy tie. There's your lateral line showing up. There's some extra flash in there. It's a great fly, tied and fished as is. But you can dress it up a little bit more. So here's a couple of ideas for you on how you might dress up this fly. Finish that off. So, idea number one. You can put some jungle cock on there. And this is fake jungle cock. And it's tied, or printed rather, I should say, on paper. So the idea behind jungle cock is to give the fly an eye. So a bait fish has an eye. So you typically want an eye on your flies. So I'm just going to hold that there and see if you like it. I tend to like it. I tend to fish these with jungle cock eyes because it gives it a point of focus, a focal point for the fish that you're trying to catch. And so I like the look of jungle cock on a marabou fly or just about any fly. But the other thing that you can do is you can put a cone head on here. And one of the beautiful things about tying on plastic tubes, this is just a small weighted cone head, and I can just slide that right over the end of the plastic tube fly, and that will give that fly a little bit of extra weight where legal. The other thing it does is, you'll notice these little holes in there, is that it helps to make the water more turbulent right at the head of the fly, so you tend to get a little bit more action down in the marabou section. It will get your fly a little bit deeper. It will also, so the manufacturer claims, and I think they're correct, give the fly a little bit more action. You can also do both. So you could both put the jungle cock in and use the cone head. And that's also a great look. I've also seen people use slightly different patterns, but incorporate rubber legs, jungle cock, and the cone head in there, all for a look that they're really convinced is going to be what the fish are looking for in that particular day. And I think one of the nice things about tying on plastic tubes is that you have a tremendous amount of options. And so you can remove jungle cock, you can pull this head off, you can go for just a regular cone head if you want to, which will be a little bit smaller than this particular head, but will be heavier. So this is a fairly lightly weighted head. And if you want your fly to get down more quickly, you can use a heavier tungsten cone head. And then once the fly is tied, it's very easy to finish off your tube. You simply, I think the best way to go is to take a safety razor blade, but you can also just cut it. Boom, like that. And then if you find the rear of the tube is too long, you can do the same thing back there. So I can cut that. So that would be the final finish on the tube right there. So I like my hook in the back one, so the hook will go slot right in to the back of the tube. And you don't need a junction tubing or anything on this particular tube. Just slide your hook right in there. And I like the materials to cover up the hook. So I always, my own personal preference anyway, is, let me stick this back in the vise here and you'll see it a little bit more clearly. My own personal preference is to have the materials covering up the hook. So if I put my hook on, there's the end of my tube. That hook is going to be camouflaged in the back of the fly. The other nice thing about tying on a tube is it allows you to change your hook out. And so typically when you're fishing, if you're fishing down deep, then you're going to hook rocks or other stuff on the bottom of the river. Your hooks dull up. And So one of the nice things about fishing a tube is if your hook is gone, you can put a new hook on there and you can save the fly that you've tied. And so you can change out the size of the hook. You can go from singles to doubles where legal, and you can go from smaller to larger hooks, all while keeping the exact same fly. And one sort of really clever technique when fishing down deep is to use a hook that's not particularly strong. Strong enough to land a fish, but not so strong that if you hook a rock, you're not going to be able to straighten that hook out. And I actually like to be able to straighten that hook out because then I won't break the hook off and I will be able to get my fly back. So I will pull everything in. My hook will be straightened out, but I will just put a new hook on there and I'm back in business. So that's a sort of a subtle advantage to fishing a tube fly when you're fishing down deep for Pacific salmon or steelhead, or occasionally for Atlantic salmon early in the season. So the other thing you can do is start to mix and match colors as you feel. So if you're fishing water that's particularly clear, I like darker, more muted patterns. If the water is dirty, you can start to liven it up with pink, and this is a cerise, yellow, orange, all kinds of bright materials. And it adds some variation to your fly tying, but you're also prepared for a wide variety of conditions that you may see on the river. And so that's definitely an advantage. So in very, very clear water, I tend to like drab, muted patterns. And then as the water gets dirtier and less transparent, I will oftentimes go to a brighter pattern. But believe it or not, these darker patterns also show up very, very well in turbulent water. And so if you had one style or one color pattern to choose, I would go with the darker patterns. And the darker patterns give you a profile that is easily visible in a wide variety of different water clarities, and then slowly start to incorporate some other variations in the colors. But pretty tough to beat purple and black, blue and black. Those are sort of, I think if you ask the average steelheader, winter steelheader, those are your go-to colors for winter steelhead. And certainly for fall run Atlantic salmon, where we use these types of flies quite a bit, I would say the exact same thing is true, that the darker patterns tend to fish well in a variety of conditions. The brighter patterns, typified by hot oranges and pink cerise, tend to fish only in very clear water or when there's high sun, and they're not as effective. But you can still fish these in the very clear water with very high sun, and they still produce very well. So probably your best all-around color combination, the black and blue tube fly tied on a plastic pro tube with a cone head on the front. So just to go over the materials again, we've got two colors of marabou, dark blue and black, hence the name black and blue. And then we have a wider flashabou for the lateral line, and then we have angel hair for a little bit of extra flash. And all of those materials are available at tridentflyfishing.com. That's tridentflyfishing.com. And including the tubes as well as the tube holder. And I think you'll enjoy fishing marabou tube flies. Thank you.